My name is John Cho-Polizzi. I am a literary translator of contemporary German literature and an assistant professor of German and comparative literature at the University of Michigan. I'm going to first kind of give a little introduction to Fatma Aydemir, to her work, a bit of context for the book, and then we're going to do a couple of short bilingual readings. We'll kind of hold a conversation in between, but if any of you have urgent questions throughout, please just raise your hand. We have someone with a microphone that can come around, and we'd like, as much as possible, for this to be a conversation. So if you would like to join in at any time, just lift up your hand, and we'll try to bring you in as quickly as possible. So Fatma Aydemir is a German language author, journalist, editor. She worked for a long time as a journalist and as sort of an editor at cultural magazines. You worked for the Taz in Berlin, sort of a daily newspaper. You also worked for Missy magazine, more a cultural magazine on typically contemporary feminist issues, but also a culture magazine on art and film and literature. More recently, you've been the editor of Delphi magazine, which is a literary journal. It publishes short texts in German and German language translations of poetry, prose from other languages into German. I think we're currently in the third volume, right?
We're working on the fourth right now, yeah.
Fourth right now. So Fatma's first novel, Ellbogen, was published in 2017 and immediately won a lot of awards. It won 2 prizes for sort of the best debut novel. It was subsequently turned into a stage production and now into a film, which again I would highly recommend watching tomorrow. It will be shown at 11. I got a chance to see it in New York. It is a really great film adaptation of your first novel. Ellbogen is a coming-of-age story. It's told in the first-person perspective, which is significantly different, I think, than Fatma's second novel, which we're going to be reading from today. Ellbogen is, however, not available in English translation, but the film is. So another reason you might want to see it while it's here, especially if you like what you hear today from her second novel. But between these 2 novels, you also were the co-editor of an essay collection, Eure Heimat is unser Albtraum, Your Homeland Is Our Nightmare, which is a really important contribution to contemporary German language, I would say, because you have also writers that are from the larger German-speaking world, not just Germany. It's an intersectional collection of essays from various writers, journalists, playwrights, authors, poets, looking at different aspects of belonging and participation in conversations around what it means to be German. From a number of marginalized positions. We have the sort of post-migrant position of, the children or grandchildren of guest workers. We have Jewish German voices, Muslim German voices, queer voices, looking at the ways in which people come to understand what it means to belong and participate in Germany. This essay collection is also available in English translation online for those of you that are interested in kind of looking at the broader context of what Fatma works on and other writers that you're associated with. And finally, we come to Djinns, which came out in 2022. It was shortlisted for the German Book Prize. The English language translation has just come out a couple weeks ago, but there have been a number of other stagings or translations, so to speak, of this novel as well. It was adapted 3 different ways for the theater in Germany. It's been translated or is currently being translated into about 16 languages. It's an ongoing bestseller in Germany, and is a story that in many ways is quite representative, I think, of German literature today, but also a controversial novel. Okay. It's taught in schools. It's immediately sort of been canonized into this contemporary German literary field, but it is also a book that really pushes back on a lot of conventions and assumptions about German literature. It's a family novel, which is a very German genre, I would say, but it's a very fresh take on a family novel. It is six family members, the Yilmaz family, a Kurdish, Turkish immigrant family in Germany. Each chapter is told from the perspective of a different member of this family. It's bracketed by the 2 parent stories, and 4 of the children in the family each tell their own story. Each of the chapters functions sort of like a freestanding short story, They all have a unique voice, a unique perspective, but when you read the 6 stories together, you come to understand how they fit together as parts of a greater whole, and of course also to see what is missing from each person's story, and just the way that the family dynamics are construed as such. I think before I talk too much, we'll just jump into it. We're going to read from the first chapter, Hüseyin. Fatma's going to begin in German, and then we're going to switch off, and I'm going to read from the English translation.
Hi, I'm very loud. I'm very glad to be here. It's my first time in Boston. I forgot to bring my German copy of the book. I'll only read a paragraph in German every time we're reading, just for you to, you know, somehow enjoy the sound maybe. Yeah, I'll start out. It's the first page, so you don't need to know everything. Hüseyin. Weißt du, wer du bist, Hüseyin, wenn du die glänzenden Konturen deines Gesichts im Glas der Balkontür erkennst? Wenn du die Tür öffnest, auf den Balkon trittst und dir warme Luft übers Gesicht streicht und die untergehende Sonne zwischen den Dächern der Wohnblocks von Seetebunde leuchtet, wie eine gigantische Apfelsine? Du reibst dir die Augen, vielleicht denkst du, vielleicht war jede Hürde und jeder Zwiespalt in diesem Leben nur dazu da, um irgendwann hier oben zu stehen und zu wissen, ich habe mir das verdient, mit dem Schweiß meiner Stirn.
Hüseyin, do you know who you are, Hüseyin, when you see the shining contours of your face in the reflection on the balcony door? When you open the door, stride across the balcony and a warm breeze caresses your face, while the setting sun glimmers between the rooftops of the apartments in Zeytinburnu like a giant tangerine. You rub your eyes. Maybe, you think, maybe every obstacle and every conflict in this life was only there so that one day you could stand up here and know, I've earned this for myself, with the sweat of my brow. You hear the first evening call to prayer from the balcony of the apartment, the spacious 3-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor, the apartment you worked and saved for almost 30 years while raising your 4 children and providing your wife with an admittedly humble but never meager life. You lived your days to the rhythm of 3 shifts, Hüseyin. You took on every Sunday, every holiday, overtime, took advantage of every available bonus in the metalworks to make sure your family could get by, to buy new football cleats for the little one, pay off the older one's debts, and still set a little something aside. And now you've finally done it. You're 59 and a homeowner. In a few years, when Ümit finishes school and you can finally leave Germany, that cold, cold-hearted country, there'll be an apartment waiting for you in Istanbul with your name at the door, Hüseyin. You've finally found a place you can call home. And you, Hüseyin, you already knew that someday you would return to Istanbul. Already the first time you arrived in the city, back then you'd come by train from your village, you disembarked here for a week, you stayed with relatives before you boarded the bus and then the train to southern Germany where you were assigned a job. They put you in a line with other workers there, they inspected your naked bodies and they examined the contents of your underpants. That was in the spring of 1971. Germany was not what you had hoped it would be, Hüseyin. You'd hoped for a new life. But what you received instead was loneliness. And loneliness can never be a new life, for loneliness is a cycle, the constant repetition of the same memories inside your head, the perpetual search for new wounds within your long-departed ego, the longing for those people you left behind, but what could you do, Hüseyin? You couldn't just return to your village, and so you stayed, and you did the things you had to do so that your coming here would at least make sense.
Thank you, John.
I guess my question, or at least a question that has come up often when we read from this first chapter, which perhaps will provide a little context for the remaining chapters, is that you chose to tell this chapter from the second-person perspective, whereas most of the chapters are told from a third-person perspective that's not necessarily omniscient. It's very centered around the individual characters, but it still has a level of removal. And with the two parent stories, you tell them in the second person. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. It's actually, so the second person in this first chapter actually came from or evolved from a year of rewriting this chapter, experimenting with it, because the first text or the first part of the text I had was this first chapter in a very rough draft. So I only had the character of the father, Hüseyin. I had his story of, this worker, labor migrant from Turkey in Germany who has, worked so many years, saved some money, goes to Istanbul, wants to buy an apartment there, a city that, he's not from, so he doesn't have a connection actually to Istanbul. It's not, in a sense, a going back, but rather maybe the goal or the dream of building a home for himself, or finding home in a completely detached place, in a sense. It's not completely detached, but it's a place where he at least, speaks the language and knows the cultural codes even better than in Germany, where he has lived for decades. And so yes, when I wrote about Hüseyin, who I found interesting because he could be my grandfather, like he's loosely based on my grandparents, these two figures, the mother and the father. But they belong to this first generation of labor migrants who came, in the 60s, 70s to Germany. And I knew a lot of people from this generation, and I thought I know them very well, but once I started to work on this chapter, work on Hüseyin's perspective, I figured out that I don't know so much about them actually. Like, I don't know how it felt to, emigrate to Germany from a very rural area in Turkey, not knowing anything about German history also, like coming from a background with very little or no education, school education, and coming to this society that, where the Holocaust took place just 20 years before that, but nobody's really speaking about it. So it's also not that there's a conversation in society going on about it. And through interviews that I did for this book, I found out also that many of the people in this first generation learned about the Holocaust only months or even years after they had moved to Germany. And I thought that must be such a particular, experience to find yourself in the middle of like the center of a very unique horror, I would say, and coming also from a state that has been very oppressive, very violent. Many guest workers actually, or the so-called guest workers, they were not actually guests because they had to work in Germany. But somehow, we like to call them still guest workers. Many of them actually use this labor migration as a legal way to escape Turkey, to build a new life somewhere else, and to escape also the very, violent assimilation politics against all kinds of minorities at that time in Turkey. And you asked me about the second person.
Yeah, but no, this is also good. I mean, this is a really important context.
Yeah, but it has a lot to do with it. So writing about Hüseyin and rewriting this chapter for a year, I figured out, okay, there's always a kind of gap between me and this person from the first generation, and the second person narrator. Somehow, when I started using it, it felt like I'm building a bridge over this gap between us, and I don't pretend that it's not there. It's it's more like I'm engaging in a dialogue with Hüseyin. It's also
maybe asking questions that you didn't get a chance to actually ask.
Somehow, yeah. But also he's engaging in a dialogue with himself in a way, or with the reader. So I kind of like the conversational aspect of using the second person narrator. And I came back to that in the last chapter when Hussein's wife, so the mother and the father have the second person, because somehow, yeah, there are many reasons for that, actually. I guess readers always have a new answer to this question, but yeah, one of the reasons is definitely because these are the perspectives that felt so much more far away from me than the children, for example.
So I don't want to give away too much. I don't want to have too many spoilers, but I believe even on the back of the book, yeah, an important plot element is given away. In the first chapter, Hüseyin dies. He's bought this apartment. He's there to furnish it. The rest of his family is going to come shortly thereafter for holidays. He's planning to retire there with his wife, but his family is still in Germany. And he dies. And in sort of proper Muslim tradition, he needs to be buried immediately. So the rest of his family has to drop everything and travel to Istanbul to try to attend his funeral. And of course, we then encounter the various other characters in the family at whatever stages in their lives they are when this happens. And in many cases, in telling their stories, these characters then come to reflect on elements from their past, things they wish they would have known more about, conversations that shaped who they were, moments with their dad that shaped who they were. And in the attempt to travel to Turkey to attend his funeral, we come to get to know the entire family. I had a reason why I was sort of contextualizing it in this way, but I think it's escaped me now. I wanted to circle back to this idea of the sort of ambiguities of migration in your story. Oh yeah, you mentioned before that there's this tension between coming to Germany and experiencing life then as a marginalized person, as an immigrant, as a guest worker, suddenly finding out about what happened during World War II, finding out about the Holocaust, realizing that you now belong to a marginalized community that is, albeit different, but also discriminated against, wondering where you stand in a society that just a few decades before had committed such a horrible crime against humanity. But then, of course, there is also the element that many of these people are escaping other experiences of forced assimilation in Turkey. We come to find out that Hussein's family is actually Kurdish, although some of the children don't know this because he forbid himself and his wife to speak Kurdish in the house, because he didn't want his children to be minorities within the minority community. But of course, many people recognize it about them anyways, and these sort of hidden elements of their story continue to develop as the different perspectives become more enmeshed in the overall telling. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these sort of layers of marginalization maybe, but also just the way in which the sort of marginalized perspective becomes ambiguous because we see it from so many different angles.
I mean, what I found interesting in having the opportunity, because in the first book, I had only one protagonist. It was a first-person narrative, in which the plot pretty much evolved from the emotional state of a person who was growing up or becoming an adult, coming of age. And now in the second book, it was just exciting to have the possibility to speak from different angles about, let's say, actually one specific time, one specific place. Of course, there are age gaps, and there are for example, the oldest daughter is left back in Turkey for a couple of years and comes later. So there are a lot of differences between them, but they're all in part of one family. And I found it interesting to look at different members of the same family and how they identify with with different things, just to have this full range of ideas of how, or ways of how identity is kind of constructed by people who are siblings, you know. So, for example, this Kurdish theme is a very interesting topic because, of course, this is, I mean, Kurdish people in Turkey have been assimilated for decades. So the time that I'm speaking about in the book, for example, is a time in which it is actually forbidden to speak the language, and it's actually also forbidden to even say out loud, I am Kurdish. That's already an act of terrorism in that time, because they don't exist according to the state, like official state law. And but you know, having come to Germany and speaking about this like heritage, some of the children are, or one child is, for example, surprised by it, has never heard of it, is surprised to hear his mother talk this language all of a sudden at the funeral. The other brother, Hakan, for example, he hears it and he becomes angry because he doesn't want to have anything to do with it, which you could call, you know, how do you say, so Selbstverneinung oder
denial of the
a
self.
denial, yeah. It's kind of a state of denial, but also, is it really denial, or is it just his choice to identify as something else, you know? So, yeah, it was just interesting to me to see. Also, for example, the queerness is an aspect in this novel that comes in shape of different characters, and to have, you know, I know it from, you know, my own background or my environment that there's this framing in German society, for example, that when a Turkish or a Kurdish person would openly come out as queer, they would be asked, how's your family reacting to that, and are you feeling comfortable, and can we help you and stuff. Like, there's always this like conception of there is like oppression, which might be true, of course, but since this book is playing, for example, is set in the 90s in Germany, it was important for me to talk also about this topic of conversion therapies, which also I read a lot of literature on it, which was also set in the States, because it has been taking place a lot in the States and people have been writing about it. But in Germany, it seems to be like, I did so many interviews with survivors of these therapies, but it's actually such a taboo to speak about it in public. There has been like so little research on it, and it's still taking place today in like this very, you know, Christian fundamentalist organizations. And I don't know, it's been a very, how should I say? Yeah, there has been a lot of controversy after the book came out from people who were accusing me of making up, you know, this conversion therapy theme in Germany, whereas their opinion was that this has never taken place, you know.
Sure. Yeah, and just sort of revealing the different ways in which the same family experiences marginalization on different levels within the family, from the outside community, from within their own community. Right, but of course, with the particular character you're talking about now, he's sent to conversion therapy by his German coach, not by his Turkish family. Mm-hmm. Right, so we see that it's sort of coming at him from both sides. He feels afraid to talk openly to his own family about his experience, but when he does try to reveal himself to his German peers, he is also discriminated against, but differently. Right, so pushing back a little bit on sort of assumptions, what we think would happen, allowing each of the characters to speak more or less for themselves.
And also to open up, you know, to think about, because it I have the feeling sometimes when we're summarizing what the book is about or the plot, it always seems like, oh, this is very depressing. Everybody's just super oppressed and, you know, they're having such a bad time, which is partly true. But
there's a lot of joy also.
It can be a sad book. Yeah, but there's also a lot of joy and dark humor, I would say. But also, like, what I would find very boring would be just to, you know, speak about characters who are always just, you know, suffering from this and that. But actually, what I'm interested in is more like looking at how a person can navigate through this path, which is always limited by certain structures, by certain moods in the particular space that they're moving in, but to always, you know, remind the character of their own autonomy somehow, to get through life and to build their own path in a sense. And yeah.
Should we hear from another character?
Yeah, sure.
So this next section is from the chapter Hakan. That is the 5th chapter. This is the perspective of the eldest son.
Again, I'm just reading the first paragraph in German. Es war nie einfach zwischen Hakan und seinem Vater. Ja, Hakan hat viel Scheiße gebaut, aber man muss auch sagen, es ist hart. Scheiße, es war hart, Hüseyins Sohn zu sein. Oder besser, sein ältester Sohn zu sein. Denn Hakan glaubt, dass Ümit als Jüngster verschont geblieben ist von diesem ganzen Mist. Wann wirst du endlich ein Mann und du als erwachsener Mann und Mann dies, Mann das. Gut für Ümit. Denn Ümit wäre niemals darauf klargekommen. Nicht mal Hakan ist ja darauf klargekommen, aber er versteht mittlerweile wenigstens, wo es herkommt. Hüseyins Bild davon, wie ein Mann zu sein hat. Es ist dieses Arbeiterding.
Things had never been easy between Hakan and his father. And yeah, of course, Hakan had stirred up a lot of shit, but you had to admit that it is hard. Fuck. It was hard to be Hüseyin's son. Or maybe better, to be Hüseyin's eldest son, because Hakan suspects that Ümit, as the youngest son, might have been spared from all the bullshit. When will you finally be a man, and you're a grown man, and man this and man that? It was a good thing for Ümit because Ümit couldn't have handled it. Hakan couldn't handle it himself, but he feels like he at least understands now where it came from, Hüseyin's ideas about what it meant to be a man. It was all part of this whole working class thing. Had Hüseyin ever done anything but work? Ever been anything but a worker? Hakan can't really say. Hüseyin had always kept busy. Hüseyin had always toiled for other people, for his family. He'd always hustled. Always action, never talk, no extra risks, everything on the safe side, always occupied. No unnecessary chatter, no frivolous things, not a penny wasted. Hüseyin wasn't just any old worker. Hüseyin had been born to work. He had it in his blood. Some people have that. Hakan doesn't. Because Hakan knows there are thousands of ways to make money faster than standing around at a conveyor belt and subjugating yourself to some piece of shit foreman. No chance. He'd rather bury himself in debt and have his own business. Fuck it. At least he'd have something of his own. No boss, no master, no fucking overseer. He could always make his own decisions. And yeah, okay, maybe the occasional decision from a business partner here and there. Maybe even a difficult partner. Maybe a partner who mostly exploited your business to wash his own dirty income clean, but not a boss. Nowhere. No bosses, never. And always, the whole time, the hope that his used car business would at some point pay off. Despite the stiff competition, hope that he'd somehow make a name for himself and people would flock to his store, well, to his parking lot. There wasn't really a store in that sense of the word. Hakan had only rented out a tiny bit of asphalt in the industrial part of town. There was just a metal shipping container where he could make himself and his buddies a chai, if you could call that a store, but it was a start. The main thing was setting your goals high, not letting yourself be satisfied with little things and the dismal grind that every bum out there was content to call a life. The mood alone on the assembly line before Hakan had dropped out of his training program at Weisburg had been enough. The way his colleagues talked to one another, hey, what's up, working, you know, gotta do what you gotta do. Hakan could only laugh at this gotta do what you gotta do, but not because he thought it was funny. He found it unbelievably depressing, gotta do, okay, but gotta do what? Everyone's always gotta work somehow, fine, but who said you gotta work yourself to death here at this fucking cosmetics factory? No one. Hakan could give two shits about all of it, diligence, decorum, etc., etc. Yeah, of course, he could respect these things his father placed so much value in, yeah. Of course, Hakan could understand where his father got these ideas. Baba didn't know anything different. But Hakan does. Hakan knows there's another way. It might not be as comfortable as a factory job. Go to work, put on your uniform, stamp in, hustle, grind, stamp out, collapse at home in front of your TV, wake up, do it again. But Hakan would rather lie awake at night beside Lena, his veins pumped full of adrenaline because he thinks they're coming for him. They'll knock at his door any minute now, the Italians or the Albanians or whatever sons of bitches Hakan just unintentionally made an underhand deal with on what turned out to be a stolen car. There's always some headache involved. Some headache and some sleepless nights, yeah, but that's his business. And it's still better than plodding along like a donkey between the TV and couch and the conveyor belt, the circular pilgrimage, day in, day out for your entire fucking life until one day, like Hüseyin, you just, no.
Thank you, John. Wow, I heard you read this out loud for the first time, this section. And yeah, it just reminds me how, I mean, all of the characters, I do work a lot with, like, when I write something, I often read it aloud in my room, you know, because, you know, yeah, the sound and the rhythm is so important to, especially when I'm just like developing a character and it's pretty new. It's very important to me how they sound, how they would talk, what would they see in order to actually work out a plot, so that first comes the character and then everything else. So I really like how you actually stayed very, or yeah, close to the sound of a character rather than to the exact meaning of every word.
Yeah, I mean, so Hakan, his character, he speaks a lot of slang. He listens to American hip-hop. He fancies himself a rapper and a dancer, and he has a very particular way of framing his German experience in a way that's legible to him, in a way that somehow, I wouldn't say glorifies, because that's not quite fair, but somehow makes his own experience more bearable. He likes to build excitement into the way he presents himself in the world. And he speaks in a very marked language that would be really difficult to translate one-to-one, because he makes a lot of jokes, there's a lot of humor in what he says, but there's also this sort of sad vulnerability to his character too, because it's all a show. And his little brother looks up to him, but the other people in his family see through the show. They know he's actually not doing well, but he has to always perform this identity. And to really carry that sort of a voice across, sometimes little tweaks need to be made, right? To allow the character to speak in a believable way in English, but also to stay true to the character's ideas, his intentions. I mean, Hakan even fairly frequently cites from English hip hop lyrics when he's talking, or when it's just sort of the narrator describing his experience and what he's listening to. And this is sometimes difficult then to translate into English, because there's a certain thing that happens when you're reading a text in German and then there's a sentence in English. Yeah, maybe our generation recognizes that these are lyrics or this is some sort of cultural citation, but there's also code switching happening. And there's also Hakan trying to be cool because he knows a few English lyrics. And there's this whole performance that comes along with it that is flattened by an English translation. So this particular passage doesn't contain an example like this, but sometimes in translating Hakan's character, I also wanted to make it really present for the reader that actually this is not an American kid, this is a German kid, and he is making references to cultural things in America because for him it makes his life more exciting. So sometimes I would leave things that Hakan says in German, or I would even back translate some kind of a joke or a reference that Hakan makes and write it slightly differently and leave it in German, or maybe write part of it in English but leave a couple German words in, because I also wanted to remind the reader, like, this is all a show, this is not really his life. Actually, he's speaking German here. So this is, I mean, I really enjoyed translating his character. I think he has a deceptive amount of depth to his character.
Yeah.
And you really have to get that right to see the vulnerability there, because it's all a show.
Yeah, and that was Yeah, it is a show and it's not a show. It's interesting that you're really, you know, of course, but all, like for every one of us, our life is a performance and a show, but it's also, it's really not. But
Sure.
yeah, and the thing with Hakan was it's one of the characters that where I had to really rewrite the whole chapter again because I noticed that, you know, this like youngster, I had like an image of Hakan which was also loaded with stereotypes, and I didn't want to admit to that, but it actually was. So I had to start writing the whole chapter again from the beginning, just to talk a little more about where he's coming from, or how I had the idea of Hakan is that, so Hakan grows, yeah, he's a teenager in the 80s in Germany, and you know, it's interesting how you were talking about his like glorification of, you know, his heritage or being an immigrant kid in Germany, glorifying it. This was not something that was really happening in the 80s or 90s. You were either, you know, trying to not show or not talk about it or assimilate sort of, or, you know, I have the feeling that until like before, for example, the hip hop culture really became popular in Germany, this like let's say pride in the community was always tied to very folkloristic things, folklore culture, traditional, also conservative in a sense. That was not very interesting to the teenagers, or most of them at least. But then, you know, through the military bases, a lot of the kids in the 80s got in touch at the US military bases. A lot of the young people got in touch with hip hop culture first before it was like a thing on TV back then, or on the radio. And especially, I think it was the things that you could not, you know, I mean, you knew the music from the radio, but you didn't know about b-boying, for example, and, you know, getting into this dance thing over the military bases or through the big, you know, festivals and events that were taking place and got very popular throughout the 80s. Like all the teenagers wanted to go there. So that was interesting to do the interviews with people from back then and finding out like how it actually fueled their, you know, quest in finding a way to build community beyond the folkloristic and boring things their parents were involved in.
I mean, this might be a point that needs a little bit more context, but, you know, the United States during the Cold War had numerous bases in Germany with tens of thousands of American soldiers stationed there. And very often in more urban settings, the neighborhoods where immigrant communities lived were right next to the military bases. They were the undesirable parts of town. And so there are a lot of stories from our generation of Germans who grew up in these marginalized communities coming into contact, particularly with Black American soldiers, feeling a sense of commonality and shared experience and sharing in experiences of hip-hop culture. And this was really the birth of, you know, sort of Turkish-German hip-hop culture in particular, but also just hip-hop as a form of resistance in the German language community. And the experiences that Hakan and his friends have that he thinks back on in his childhood, I mean, these are actually these sort of shared experiences of a generation of Germans, but they don't appear often in film, they don't appear often in literature, but they're things that people talk about, right? Like people in our generation experience that in Germany. But I think Djinns is really one of the first literary treatments of this sort of intersection, and also thinking about self-determination, coming from this minoritized, marginalized position and claiming it and being proud of it and pushing back, taking words that are used as, you know, slurs against your community and appropriating them. And this is a big part of Hakan's identity that I think really comes out as his character is revealed. Mm-hmm. You see the vulnerabilities behind it, but you also see that he's trying to do something in a way that I think pushes back on a lot of the assumptions that, you know, people tend to associate with either Turkish-German culture or the appropriation of, you know, American resistance culture, protest culture abroad. you trace that out very nicely in his story.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the idea was that we would do one more short reading from a different chapter, and then we'd sort of open up to questions from all of you. We have about another 20 minutes. So the next chapter that we're going to read from is the 4th chapter. Peri, she is the youngest daughter. She's the only member of the family to attend university. And she and her little brother travel with their mother together to Istanbul for the funeral. This is a scene where we're going to jump around a little bit in this chapter, but it begins with a scene where she's speaking with her youngest brother, and then kind of will go into just some of her own reflection and backstory.
Peri hört sie Ümit auf ihrem Schoß murmeln. Sie streichelt ihm über die Wange und spürt, wie sein Kopf sich von ihr zu lösen versucht. Ihm fehlt die Kraft, sein Oberkörper entspannt sich wieder und bleibt liegen. Was ist ein Djinn? Fragt Ümit. Peri spürt, wie ihr Kälte unter die Haut schießt, wie jedem Menschen, der in einem muslimischen Haushalt aufgewachsen ist und dieses Wort hört, in einem Totenhaus, bei Nacht.
Peri, she hears Ümit murmur. She strokes his cheek, sensing him trying to free himself from her, but he doesn't have the strength. His upper body relaxes again, and he remains lying on her lap. Peri, what is a djinn? Ümit asks. Peri feels the cold creep through her skin, like anyone who's grown up in a Muslim home hearing this word, in this house of death, at night. She looks up, notices that the same creepy show is still running on the TV. Is it something like a ghost? Ümit asks. His eyes are glued to the ceiling. Yes, Peri says. She thinks for a moment, or maybe no, not entirely. Did Ümit just pick up the word djinn from the TV, or had he simply built up the courage for the first time to finally ask her what a djinn was? Hadn't all her siblings, cousins, neighbors, grown up with the same constant fear of these invisible beings, despite the fact that they were seldom spoken of? People wouldn't even speak their name aloud. In Turkish, djinns were often called those with the 3 letters rather than djinn, for fear one might accidentally summon them with the word and then be unable to rid oneself of them again. What was the plural form of djinn? Djinns? Maybe the fear of djinns was really more about not understanding what a djinn really is. And was this any different with death? Wasn't it the vagueness, the uncertainty, the darkness that people feared because these things remain intangible, because we have to fill them with our own fantasies, and nothing is truly more wretched than our own fantasy? Does Lauryn Hill really rap in her new song about a Muslim sleeping with a djinn? Peri had found what she was looking for in Nietzsche, even if just a while. Of course, Peri's classmates' interest in Nietzsche was completely different from her own. And while Peri searched in Human, All Too Human for answers to the questions that haunted her, those questions that tortured her day and night like an endless migraine throbbing in her eyes, like the display of some ticking time bomb named survival, the others looked at Nietzsche like some old demented uncle, someone they had to be acquainted with, but someone who meant nothing to them personally, except as an extra bit of cultural capital. They did not do battle with him. They did not need to vanquish him. They saw themselves as his worthy equals, as parts of a greater whole, a cultural history stretching back for centuries to a time to which they all secretly wanted to return. A desire they could maintain because for them, it was self-evident that they would always have existed on the same side of the power dynamic. They could be certain that they would never have been servants or serfs, but always the savants, the wealthy, those from the finest houses who passed their time drinking wine, reading for leisure, and fucking their concubines. Peri, on the other hand, had never seen herself as part of anything. She didn't even know where she came from. Karlsruhe was simply the name of some distant place that remained every bit as enigmatic as Hüseyin's imprecise tapping on the upper right-hand corner of the map of Turkey, somewhere just before the border of Armenia. Her own search for her heritage ended in the silence beneath her father's mustache and those unpredictable phases between her mother's blank stares and tears. Assimilation, Peri thought, had no history. Assimilation was the opposite of history. It was history's end, history's extermination. It was that empty feeling in her heart whenever someone spoke of homesickness. It was the absent impulse to correct people who mispronounced her name, because what if it wasn't their pronunciation that was wrong, but Peri's name itself? At the end of the day, like so many other things in Peri's life, her master's thesis had grown out of the impulse not to simply conform to the image others had of her, and while people like Armin or Peri's classmates at university enjoyed the freedom of deciding for themselves what they liked and didn't like, Peri was constantly being told from the outside what her interests should be. And she seemed and still seems to be condemned to always do precisely the opposite. And so yes, she really was interested in Nietzsche, and no, she didn't believe in monogamy, and yes, she read feminist theory, but she also went to raves and listened to hip-hop, even if the other ladies in her women's study group did not approve. And no, she didn't have to turn her back on her family to emancipate herself. She could do it all and still wear the same hat, albeit always with a tightness in her chest, but at least she could. Yeah, that's about all for our reading, folks. We would be very open to talking a little more about the book, talking about the translation project, answering any questions that any of you as readers have. Yeah, why don't we start with you? We have a microphone coming around.
Yeah, I'd be interested how long the translation took you and how you collaborated while you translated.
Sure. Okay. That's a few questions, so I'll try to answer them as best I can. The translation, well, I'm not a full-time translator. I'm a professor at the university, so translation is sort of secondary for me because it's not something that is immediately recognized in my primary work towards promotion, towards tenure. I translate books that I care deeply about, books that I like, books that I feel are important to contemporary German literature. And so I tend to only translate 1 or 2 books a year. I think if I were working, like the actual time I spent working on this book was just a couple months, but I did it over the course of about half a year because I had other things that I had to concentrate on at various times. I was really lucky in translating this. Towards the end, I received a fellowship at the Literary Colloquium in Berlin, so I was able to spend a month there. By that time, I had largely finished the manuscript, but I really had a month to myself to edit it very heavily. Fatma is also Berlin-based, so we could meet up more often, but we'd been in communication already. Fatma mentioned that the first chapter started as sort of a standalone, that she was trying to work through the characters, understand who the father was, and I actually translated a version of that first chapter for her before the book was published, that she was reading at sort of literary festivals in Europe. So I had some engagement with the text before. Fatma and I had worked on other projects in the past, so we had a working relationship already. And when I translate something, I often try to produce a shorter sample translation for the author early on to get as much feedback and sort of criticism as I can, but also to get a sense of what the author's interests are, priorities are. Fatma studied American studies, so her English is very good. She reads a lot of English language literature. I wanted to know when she reads her voice through my voice, what she likes and doesn't like, what her priorities are, what she wants me to pay attention to. So I did the sample translation of the first chapter and then an excerpt from another chapter, and she gave me a lot of feedback on those. And of course, each chapter has its own individual voice, so it wasn't that in hearing her feedback on one chapter, I knew exactly how to translate another, but I did have a good sense for what her interests and priorities were. And I felt like after getting detailed feedback on some passages, I had a much better sense of how I should translate. And of course, there are always a few sentences, a few words where maybe I recognize it's a play on words, maybe I don't understand a joke, things like that, where I would reach out to Fatma and ask her. I'd give her, a couple sentences per chapter where I said, I don't know what to do with this. Or places where I understood that maybe there was a joke happening or some kind of a play on words that didn't translate well into English, and how I might be able to bring that same humor or that same sense of playfulness into maybe a different part of the same page or the same chapter or the same character, to try to preserve things that, get lost in translation.
Okay, that's so in this brilliant tapestry you build of this family, these family relations, the different sibling relationships to each other, seen from the different sides, the relationship to their parents and because of birth order and all that. What struck me is the tremendous compassion you have for all of your 6 main characters. And you see things from their point of view or why they acted the way they acted. And I get the sense that there really is, unlike many books, there really is no villain here. Even though people are angry about a lot of things, you don't put down the book and think, that damn father or that mother or whatever. And I wondered if that was something that you struggled with, and how you went about getting these different perspectives so that you could see that no one was right and no one was wrong.
Yeah, thank you for this interesting question. I think that I love villains from like a literary perspective, and I really don't like heroes. They're so boring to me as a writer, to write heroic stories. So I would say, yeah, there are no villains, or all of them are villains at some point also. I think, yeah, it's just that someone recently asked me about it, and then I came to realize what I'm actually, because, most of the time as writing or any kind of artistic practice, we do a lot of things without really consciously knowing what this is about. And I came to realize that actually this indefinite limitations sometimes between, the victim of a situation and, the perpetrator. That these lines are not always very definite. It always, of course, depends on what the subject is. But, within these family dynamics, and also, having the possibility to, speaking from all the different angles, it was very important for me to be compassionate with all of the characters, actually to really love all my characters, and also to some extent, be annoyed by them or even start to hate them. Really comes as close as possible to them and have an understanding of, because there's always, I came to realize that there's always a way to, understand actually why people behaved a certain way, even though it can be very immoral and wrong to me. So after Djinns, this was the last novel that came out, but after that I wrote my first theater play, which has also been published now in shape of a book. And the project was about rewriting a German classic. So I rewrote Faust by Goethe, and so I took Faust's structure and plot and characters as like an orientation, but wrote a new story. And thinking about Mephisto, the devil, it was so and the story is set in today. It was so frustrating to find out, okay, it's actually really impossible for me to write a devil in today's time and set in our time, because it would be such a unrealistic story. Because what is the evil? The evil is actually in us or around us, in the conditions and structures in which we are living in, and the economy that we're taking part of. So what evil can one character bring, which who calls themselves a devil? So yeah, to answer your question, yeah, I think compassion is a very, very important thing for me as a writer, to understand my characters, but also it's very important for me to allow them to be assholes, actually. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the great conversation. So my question is regarding this family within identity topic. So I am also from Turkey, and we went through similar stuff within Turkey. So I have Arabic roots. It was forbidden to speak Arabic in the family, so my Turkish is not disrupted, which didn't happen. At the end of the day, I had an Arabic accent. I just didn't learn Arabic. I don't speak Arabic. And this, in a way, as Ayten said, it's like a choice. And I don't mind, being called Turkish. I'm happy and so on. But when I go through hard times, when I have disappointments, work-related, relationship-related, whatever, first thing comes to my mind is, is it becoming that hard because of all these past experiences that I've been through? That, if I would be native Turkish, or if I would be an Arabic, in a complete manner within Turkey, would things be different in this particular situation? This comes very naturally to me as a question. And I wanted to ask, if you ever discovered while you're writing this part, anything in this space, is this a choice, or is it something that comes from guts and kind of forces you to do something, to behave in a certain way that's kind of more cultural to you, whatever you grow up with? Unstructured question. But
No, but thank you for the question, because I was worried earlier that what I was talking about could be put or understood not in the way that I meant. I think I couldn't express myself the way I wanted. So I do believe that we have a choice always. I don't believe that we're always the victim of, discrimination, society, capitalism. We are, but not only. I do believe that to some extent we always have an autonomy, a way to, make a decision how to behave. That does not mean that being oppressed or discriminated in, for example, Turkey, is has to do with choice. Of course, you can choose to be as, invisible as possible in a sense, or try to get rid of that accent, or, change your name or whatever, or your appearance. I don't really think that it's but yeah, people, I don't even want to judge that. That's a form of survival. But so I don't really think it's I don't think it's a point. It has to do with the point of view, whether you're suffering from discrimination or not. I think probably you're right. Whenever you're angry, you're allowing to see these things. But I mean, it's from to stay with the characters maybe and not become too personal. I think it's not very. It's first of all very unproductive, but also really just depressing to see your life determined only by these factors and by nothing else. That's what I mean, actually. And this is something that keeps coming up, a lot in recent years in my Umfeld, surroundings. Yeah. And especially a lot with, I think with young people who start, politicizing, there's always this kind of moment where they feel very trapped by the political circumstances they just start to analyze. but I think there's always a way that leads out of this trap, and that is to organize with others, to find ways to move out of it, to read, to engage in culture, to build community, stuff like that. And I always try to tell that also. That's, I would say, a part of the story I'm trying to tell. And just like quickly to this like minority and minority situation. Yeah, that's, for example, that was in the German context. It was very important for me to write the story also because there's always this view of a very homogenous group. And I think this community also, you know, accepts this as self-image and makes like the minorities invisible. And it's not like, I think it's very very hard to be in that position and trying to talk about the situation without harming the bigger community somehow. So I thought it was I think it's always complicated to talk about that minority in the minority, but also I think it's very important because it raises other questions and it brings attention to nuances.
So my question is more about from a perspective of a second generation born German with migrational background. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm planning to. My question is, what do you think you can learn from your from this point of view about your family and their thoughts and how they were raised and how that influenced their behavior?
Excuse me, what I learned from...
what do you think a person reading this book can learn from about these things?
Wow. I don't know, I'm not sure, but what I hear a lot from, because the book has been out in Germany for over 2 years, is that a lot of readers approach me with, when they have a similar background, they say it raised a lot of questions about their families they didn't really ask themselves yet. So they engage, they start thinking about their biographies or family histories in a different way. And then also what I heard is that actually from people from also without a migration background, just like from people that I would have thought, okay, maybe you're really like, there's zero interest in what I'm writing, but they really find so much potential for identification just through the family motive, because it's so, the generational gaps, the idea of, I don't know, motherhood, differences between the different generations, this idea of, just like a working class person being the first in their family to go to college and stuff like that. That kind of connects, I think, beyond that also. That's what I could say.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally support what you said there. I feel like for a lot of younger Germans, they feel seen. I mean, Germany is a country today that a quarter of the population are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. If you look at school-age children, it's like a third of the population. So I think something that this book really does is insist on the fact that these immigration stories, these assimilation stories, they're also German stories, and it does it in a very tangible way. And like you say, it also makes it relatable, and it makes it so that it's not just about this experience of discrimination, but you see the humans behind these tropes, you see the human relationships, and you see the universals. And that's something that comes together within this other framework, but makes it really accessible to a lot of readers.